On this day 17 years ago, we lost the greatest entertainer the world would ever see, the king of pop, Michael Jackson. And in true MJ fashion, even his death wasn't free from media speculation and tabloid controversy. Now, the cause of death was ruled to be from acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication, which did lead to his cardiac arrest. Now, it was public knowledge that Michael suffered from various health issues such as vitiligo and lupus. He also suffered from some very obvious mental health concerns like paranoia, anxiety, and depression. But one health concern that really wasn't public knowledge until closer to his passing was the fact that he suffered from chronic insomnia. This insomnia led him to start taking the anesthetic drug known as propofol, which is a drug that is usually only given out during surgeries, and it requires some serious medical and professional observation. Now, reportedly, Michael started taking propofol somewhere around the mid-2000s after the second wave of allegations. The mental and emotional strain from that trial led to his chronic insomnia becoming pretty much unbearable. And many fans wondered for years after his passing what would lead him to taking such drastic measures just to get sleep. And it raised questions on whether or not there were other drugs that he could have tried. And there definitely were other drugs that he could have tried, but unfortunately, when you're dealing with a celebrity of his type of stature, it kind of goes into one of those whatever he wants, he gets kind of situations. Because the main problem with propofol is the fact that while it is a very powerful anesthetic, it does not actually make you feel rested. Now, what propofol does do is it provides a chemically induced unconsciousness. It completely interrupts your brain's normal functions, and while you may wake up feeling refreshed from what is basically a temporary blackout, it provides none of the actual restoration benefits of natural sleep. Another side effect from the drug is that even though you feel wide awake when you first wake up, your reflexes and coordination are still severely impaired. And honestly, knowing the details of his passing and the side effects that the drug had, when I look back at the This Is It documentary, it truly became one of the most disturbing and unsettling things I have ever seen. Because Michael, for the first time in his career, is visibly unable to move and dance like he once did. Now, his voice during the This Is It documentary was still amazing. It still sounded honestly as good as it always had, but his movements were so much stiffer, and you can literally see how he was struggling to keep up. What you are seeing on that documentary is not just an aging artist trying to warm himself up. What you are seeing is a man who is literally dying in front of our eyes. And the scariest part of that documentary, bro, is the fact that we actually watched Michael Jackson's very last day on Earth. On June 24th, 2009, Michael finished his rehearsals for the day by performing Earth Song. And Earth Song would end up being Michael Jackson's very last song that he performed. Around midnight, he wrapped up his set and he spoke to his team. He agreed to return the next day around 2 p.m. to finish the final rehearsals, and unfortunately, that never happened. And on June 25th, 2009 at 2:26 p.m., Michael Jackson was pronounced dead. His death was ruled a homicide, and his doctor, Conrad Murray, was sentenced to jail for involuntary manslaughter. Now, despite Murray being sentenced to prison, he only served like less than 2 of a 4-year sentence. He got out early due to California's prison realignment guidelines, basically stating that qualifying non-violent offenders were granted extra time credits, not to mention good behavior and prison overcrowding. All of that kind of worked in his favor, and it basically allowed him to be freed. Now, what upsets fans the most about this is that Murray really didn't show much remorse over what happened. He consistently maintained his innocence and stated that he didn't do anything wrong, despite multiple contradictory statements in certain interviews where he did express general remorse, but his overall stance was still that he did nothing wrong and that the incident was caused by Michael's own doing. But what makes that so concerning is that in May of 2009, Conrad Murray on his personal iPhone had voice recordings of Michael Jackson talking while he was heavily drugged. And I'm not gonna lie, the audio is way too disturbing for me to ever listen to again. That is genuinely the creepiest thing I've heard. But those audio files raised even more questions about Conrad Murray's innocence, because it clearly shows that he was well aware of how bad these drugs were affecting him. On top of the fact that when Michael was unresponsive on June 25th, it took Conrad Murray 20 to 30 minutes to contact anybody. Now, he did offer multiple explanations for that delay, claiming that he was unaware of the mansion's physical address, said that he was performing CPR himself. He also mentioned that he feared that emergency responders would be denied gate access or would neglect Michael Jackson. But the prosecutors, however, argued that the delay was intentional so he could conceal evidence, because during the investigation, it was revealed that Murray was attempting to hide vials of the surgical anesthetic on top of other medications before alerting security or any type of emergency services. When Michael Jackson finally reached the hospital, there were several attempts to resuscitate him, but all of those attempts unfortunately failed. Now, suspicions about the true nature of a celebrity's death is something that's very common amongst fans. I mean, it's been about 30 years since the death of Tupac and Biggie, and people to this day still talk about who really killed them and why they died. But certain celebrity deaths, like Tupac, Biggie's, and Michael's, raise more questions than answers. And sometimes those questions can turn into full-blown conspiracies. And in the case of Michael Jackson, nothing nothing is too far-fetched enough to not take into consideration. We're talking decades of rumors, humiliation, speculation, extortion, and multiple public attacks to destroy not only his image and career, but his life as a whole. And when you really look at everything that happened to Mike, it's way too obvious to ignore. And yes, his death was ruled a homicide due to medical negligence. But the more you really look into his life, the nature of his passing gets a little too sinister and dark for anybody to really just look past. Now, whether you believe that Michael Jackson's death was the result of one doctor's reckless medical decisions, or if you believe that there was something much bigger happening behind the scenes, that really depends on how you interpret the events that came before June 25th, 2009. Officially, the investigation ended with Dr. Conrad Murray, but for millions of fans around the world, the questions never really got answered. Because yeah, what happened with Conrad Murray is how Michael Jackson died, but the big question is why? And not just why, but who was truly behind the whole thing? But in order to answer that question, we would have to go back several decades before any abuse allegations, before This Is It, before his battle with Stoney, even before any child abuse allegations even came. Because to be perfectly honest, I truly believe that they killed Michael Jackson. And the deeper that I really look into all of this, bro, the more disturbing this whole thing gets. Now, before we get too deep into this whole conspiracy, if you are new to the channel, please drop a comment and hit the like button and the subscribe button. Those things may be small to you, but they are very big to me in this channel. And for all of my return viewers, thank you for your continued support and welcome back, gang. So where does this conspiracy begin? In order to answer that question, we would have to go all the way back to 1985. So in 1985, Michael Jackson made what many financial experts still believe to be one of the greatest investments in entertainment history. He purchased the ATV music publishing catalog for $47.5 million. And this acquisition gave him ownership of about 4,000 different songs, including the publishing rights to most of the Beatles catalog. But this wasn't just a regular investment. This is something that Michael was educated on and he studied. It was a very smart and strategic move to basically establish Michael's true dominance in the music industry. So not only was Michael making millions off of his own catalog, he started bringing in a lot of cash from owning other people's catalogs. Now, the one person who was the most upset about this was Paul McCartney, because Michael Jackson buying his catalog meant that he owned a lot of what Paul McCartney did. But what's so ironic about this is that Paul McCartney was the one that told Michael about it. He taught him the game when it came down to publishing and catalog rights. Every single time one of those songs were played, licensed, covered, or used in a commercial, the catalog generated revenue for Michael Jackson. Then years later, when ATV merged with Sony's publishing division to form Sony/ATV Music Publishing, Michael still retained a significant ownership stake, making his catalog one of the most valuable music assets in the world. And for most conspiracy theorists and MJ fans, this is pretty much when everything started to go downhill. Like, this was the beginning of the end. And it's not because owning publishing is wrong or anything like that. It's because it made him way too powerful in the music industry. Because I've said it once and I will say it again, despite what his vitiligo made him look like, Michael Jackson was still very much a black man in America. And a black man in America with that much power and influence is something that's never gonna fly over too well. Now, what makes this whole thing so suspicious is that prior to 1985, Michael never really had much controversy. I mean, let's be honest, the most negative press that Michael received up until that point was really involving the whole Victory Tour fiasco. You know, with the way that the tickets were sold, the pricing of the tickets, with many people feeling like Michael was starting to alienate his common fans. But as we all know, that was mostly Don King and Joseph Jackson's doing. But other than that, Michael still pretty much had a squeaky clean image. I mean, yeah, people called him weird and, you know, talked about how reclusive he was, but that was kind of it. But right around the time he purchased the ATV catalog, all of a sudden, you started seeing headlines with the words "Wacko Jacko." All of a sudden, he sleeps in like a hyperbolic time chamber. Now, all of a sudden, he owns Elephant Man's bones and a bunch of other wild media speculations that basically just made Michael Jackson's life seem like one big circus. And as reclusive as he was, Michael was still very much in tune with everything that was happening in the world, especially when it came to his name, because he addressed many of these issues, especially with videos like Leave Me Alone, where he literally made himself one big carnival. So he knew that his life had become a spectacle. Now, what didn't help this era was the fact that between 84, after the Victory Tour, and 87, when Bad came out, Michael was very off the scene. He did have a few public appearances. He had We Are the World, of course, Captain EO in 1986, but Mike was kind of off the radar. He was dealing with a lot of health issues, and this is when his lupus and his vitiligo really started to kick in. And honestly, him being off the scene at the rate that he was gave the tabloids all the ammo they needed to just run as many smear campaigns as they could, because Michael was not present or vocal enough to really defend himself. The industry was pissed. Just go ahead and call a spade a spade. But unfortunately, they didn't really have anything that could destroy this man's image. I mean, yeah, the negative headlines kind of helped, but Michael was so loved by everybody that they didn't really care. Everybody already knew that tabloids were already full of crap anyway. The only thing that kind of did taint his image a little bit was his obvious physical changes, with many people in the black community as well as other communities feeling like he was running away from his race because they didn't know that he had vitiligo, because he wasn't really public with it until the Oprah interview in like 93. So on the surface, it just looked like he bleached his skin to look white after his major success, which is not a good look. Even though we know it wasn't true, without the information of what was really going on with his skin condition, it just didn't look good. But even with that, it still wasn't enough to tarnish this man's image. Michael Jackson was literally invincible at this point, or so we thought. Michael wasn't like other celebrities. You wasn't catching Michael passed out drunk after a Hollywood party. You wasn't catching Michael doing cocaine in the back of a limo. You wasn't seeing Michael Jackson walking around with prostitutes and catching him doing none of that madness. He had a squeaky clean image. So there was honestly nothing that they could do to tarnish his name that wouldn't look like a deliberate attack. There was one thing that they could use, and outside of his music, that one thing just so happened to be the thing that Michael Jackson was the most passionate about, and that was his love for children. And the most effective way to destroy somebody is by tarnishing their image and destroying their pockets. And the child sexual abuse allegations of 1993 aimed to do just that. Now, after the Bad Tour, Michael had already stopped performing in the States because of all the media controversy that he was starting to get. And in 92, when the Dangerous Tour kicked off, he had no US dates. And when the 93 allegations came up, he actually had to cut the Dangerous Tour off early. The allegations basically ruined his reputation in the States, and he lost endorsements and brand deals. So it seemed like their plan was working. He was losing money, and people started to look at him a little bit differently. But what really hurt him in this situation is that he didn't fight the 93 allegations all the way to the end. But despite his innocence, Michael did do something that otherwise comes off as being guilty, and that was when he settled out of court for over $20 million. Now, despite various holes in the Chandler's accusations, with many people believing that they were lying from day one, unfortunately, with him settling out of court, that just kind of made him look a little suspicious. And as a result, the 90s became Michael Jackson's most stressful decade. He literally did not catch a break for the rest of his life from that point. But with Michael being fairly soft-spoken and not really speaking publicly about anything, he fought back the best way that he knew how to do, and that was through his art. Because with the 1995 History album, many fans consider that to be Michael's angry album, because majority of the songs on that album were Michael expressing his frustrations with the way the media has been treating him and using his platform to speak on other major world issues. And even though for Michael it was just another form of creative expression, the media took this as a threat, because instead of just accepting what they were trying to do to him, he decided to fight back. And he was talking a little too much in these songs. Songs like Scream, where he blatantly tells the media to stop fucking with him, and songs like They Don't Care About Us, which really gained a lot of negative attention. So much negative attention that the prison version of the They Don't Care About Us short film was actually banned. And honestly, the industry banning a music video with that positive and powerful of a message is pretty much enough proof that there was something bigger going on. So at this point, going into the late 90s and early 2000s, Michael Jackson pretty much had two different careers. Overseas, he was still seen as basically the second coming of Jesus Christ himself. But over in the States, while he did still have countless fans, his private life and controversy became a lot more popular than his artistry. And with music starting to shift more towards hip hop and R&B and younger pop acts, and with Michael approaching his late 30s going into his 40s, Michael was starting to be seen as music your parents used to listen to. So the main thing carrying Michael Jackson at this point, honestly, whether you want to admit it or not, was mainly nostalgia. People started to hold on to Michael Jackson more for what his career used to be, more so than they were for what his career was at the time. And as we enter into the 2000s, it really seemed like the higher-ups plan to destroy this man was actually working. His last full album was in 1995 with History. After that, in 97, we did get the Blood on the Dance Floor. Then in 97, we did get the Blood on the Dance Floor remix album, but it really wasn't a major studio album. And after that, Michael went quiet. Musically, that is, because unfortunately, his name was still plastered all over the tabloids. And this is also when he started to get into a lot of debt. Remember, destroy the reputation, empty the pockets. That's the strategy. So now, 6 years after his last major studio album, which up until this point was the longest gap in between projects that Michael Jackson had, he attempted to make a huge comeback with 2001's 2001's Invincible album. And this is really when the conspiracy starts to kick in. Now, at this time, Michael Jackson was signed to Sony Records, which, as I mentioned earlier, had already merged with ATV Publishing, the company that he had ownership in. Michael began working on the Invincible album around 1997, recording in multiple studios across the states. He experimented with new sounds, worked with different producers. Michael really wanted to cultivate a sound that would fit into the early 2000s R&B atmosphere. And what we got resulted in being the most expensive album in music history, totaling $30 million. Now, normally a price tag like that for Michael Jackson would be easy to, get back. That's nothing. But remember, this is not Bad era or Thriller era Michael Jackson. Hell, this isn't even Dangerous era Michael Jackson. When the album was getting ready to come out, the first single, You Rock My World, was released. And honestly, the timing of this album couldn't have been any worse, as this album started to be promoted right around the time of the September 11 attacks, a national event so major that even Michael Jackson himself couldn't outshine. The album was officially released in October of 2001, and things started to look a little suspicious, because up until this point, all we had was one lead single and one short film to accompany the album. The only other major promotional thing that happened around this album was the Michael Jackson 30th anniversary special. Michael's intention for the second single off Invincible was supposed to be Break of Dawn, but instead Cry was released as the second official single, with Butterfly starting to hit the radio waves as like an unofficial single release. But less than a year after the album released, in the summer of 2002, all of a sudden Invincible pretty much disappeared. Sony had completely stopped all of the promotional work for this album. Now, I have to remind you that this is before the streaming era. At this point, we were still buying physical media only, so listeners had to rely on radio play as well as TV outlets like BET and MTV. And with barely any promotion, the album was not going to make the money that it needed to make to get Michael out of that $30 million hole. Now, the album did debut at number 1, but it only sold 2 million copies. Now, I know saying only 2 million copies is kind of crazy because that's a lot of damn albums, but let's be honest, we're talking about Michael Jackson here. So only going double platinum is technically considered a flop by his standards. And for the first time in Michael's career, Michael was publicly angry. He went to war with Sony, very similar to what Prince had to do with Warner Brothers back in like 94. And this war got ugly, with Michael name dropping Tommy Mottola on multiple occasions, accusing him of everything from abuse to his now ex-wife Mariah Carey, purposely sabotaging the Invincible album, and he had multiple racism accusations. Sony essentially wanted to force this album to underperform so they could push Michael further into debt. Their goal with that was to try to force him to sell that catalog, because again, when he made that move, it made him the most powerful entertainer in the industry. And need I remind you, this was still a black man. They don't want that kind of power, bro. It is what it is. You can try to deny racism all you want to, bro, but you can't. Fortunately for Michael, but unfortunately for them, it didn't work 100% because he never let go of that catalog. After the Invincible era, Michael pretty much let it go. He had fell back into being a recluse, and the last song that he recorded was One More Chance in like 2003, a single that wasn't officially released until the Michael Jackson #1's compilation album. The Invincible era technically ended in 2002, making it Michael Jackson's shortest lived era, and then in 2005, the next big attempt at ruining Michael Jackson's life occurred. Michael Jackson agreed to do a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson with none other than Mr. Martin Bashir, and that documentary ended up being probably the worst mistake he ever made in his life, because that documentary was then formatted in a way to make him look like the most egregious child predator of all time. This second wave of allegations in the 2005 trial further ruined his reputation even more than what it already was. It caused more financial strain, more mental strain, caused his health issues to get even worse, and allegedly this is around the time that he started using propofol, which ended up being his cause of death. The 2005 trial was so damaging for Michael that he literally abandoned Neverland. After the trial was over, he left it, barely packed anything. He still had groundskeepers that were working there, but Michael was gone. He was pretty much done with America and everything as a whole. He actually moved overseas for some time. And unfortunately, a lot of people who believed that he was innocent in 93 started to doubt his innocence, because how do you get accused of the same thing multiple times? And let's not even talk about the other child abuse allegations that came in between those years that didn't really make media attention like that. People were literally just lying on his name, saying that he touched their kids just so they can get some money. Thankfully though, all of that was proven to be completely incorrect, and it never really reached public light. But it did happen, and it definitely took more of a toll on him. And again, bro, I really believe that all of this was intentional. It was all a part of the plan. Now, one thing that Michael Jackson publicly hated, and he said it a few times, he hated touring. He hated going on tour. Michael had been touring since he was a child. We're talking about somebody who died at 50, who had a 45-year career. If it's 2009, damn near the 2010 2010s and I have been touring since the 60s, I too wouldn't want to go anywhere. But unfortunately, with the amount of debt that he had and the amount of damage that his career took, he was literally desperate. He needed the money. A new album wasn't going to cut it. You can throw brand deals out the window because nobody really wanted to touch him at the time. And let's be honest, a lot of celebrities say they love Michael Jackson so much, and when the biopic came out, everybody was so in love with him. But if you were old enough like me to remember what was going on around that time, Michael Jackson was the butt of damn near every single joke throughout the 2000s. And this is all on record. Like, you can go on YouTube and like look up all of this stuff. People were always laughing at him. He had very few public defenders and very few people who actually spoke out in support of him. Not everybody can be Chris Tucker. I'm just saying. Not everybody can be Elizabeth Taylor. I'm just saying. Because, you know, you had people like Jack Black who thought it was funny that Michael Jackson received a fake award. You also had platforms like MTV who Michael literally had to save multiple times, who allowed this prank to happen. What I'm talking about is on MTV when they gave Michael what was supposed to be like the Artist of the Century or Artist of the Millennium Award, but it ended up just being a freaking cake topper. And apparently everybody knew about the joke except him, and he gave this very heartwarming speech and everybody thought the shit was just a fucking joke. So yeah, like I said, people claim to love him so much now, but if you know, you know. But see, 4 years after the 2005 allegations occurred, Michael Jackson made a very big announcement. And that announcement was that he was going to be doing a series of shows. And if I'm not mistaken, originally it was only like 5 or 6 shows, and it was going to be in London only, kind of like a residency thing like they do in Las Vegas. But eventually it ended up being a 50-show tour. Now, when Michael announced the tour, he looked healthy. He seemed happy. He seemed confident. And it honestly looked like he could do all 50 shows. Because despite what Gen Z believes, you are not cooked as soon as you turn 30. At the time of the announcement, Michael was just 49 years old. In no way, shape, or form is a 49-year-old man old. And in no way, shape, or form should a 49-year-old man have been in that bad of health. To the public eye, we couldn't tell. And the thing with the This Is It tour is that not only did it get expanded from a residency to a tour, it was going to potentially be a world tour, meaning Michael may have performed in the States for the first time since the 30th anniversary special. And this tour was going to be major. So major that it was projected to gross between 1.1 and 1.5 billion dollars. And that profit not only would have allowed Michael to retain his ownership in Sony ATV, but it would have gotten him completely out of debt. And on top of getting him out of debt, it would have made so much money that he would have pocketed a shit ton of bread. And Michael Jackson could have easily retired as the wealthiest artist of all time, dead or alive. And that is literally not what they were going to let happen. That man had a target on his back since the mid 80s, and they have tried every single thing they could to tarnish that man's reputation and drive him absolutely insane. And you seriously think that they're going to just let him retire with probably the most successful world tour of all time, completely out of debt, still with all of his ownership and a huge payoff? Not gonna happen, bro. Not only was this Michael's final attempt at saving his life, this was their final attempt at ending his life. Because ironic enough, Conrad Murray was not Michael Jackson's doctor until a month before he passed away. And this is when the conspiracy gets a little too weird to ignore, because Michael has had plenty of doctors throughout his years, especially since the Pepsi incident when he burned half his scalp off. He's never died under any of their watches. But you get hired and a month later, he's gone? Find that very suspicious. In May of 2009, that's when Conrad Murray became Michael Jackson's doctor. And almost immediately, he gave Michael pretty much any drug he wanted. Conrad Murray gave Michael Jackson so much propofol that they even had a nickname for the drug that they shared amongst themselves. Because of the drug's milky white substance, Michael nicknamed it milk. So whenever he couldn't sleep, he would ask Conrad Murray for some milk. And what makes that even more strange is that also in May of 2009, when Conrad Murray started working with Michael, that was when he had the recordings of Michael Jackson extremely drugged and talking crazy. Like, I've never heard Michael's voice sound like that. It almost seems like he got those audio recordings so he could let certain people hear it so they could document just how bad his health was getting. Like, yeah, I'm here, I'm doing my assignment. Take a listen to these and you can see just how bad this man is. And to be perfectly honest, if nothing else proved that Michael Jackson was innocent of everything that they claimed he did, the most positive thing that I can take from those recordings is that it really proves that Michael was 100% innocent. Because naturally, if somebody is heavily under the influence, whether it be drugs or heavily induced alcohol or whatever, 9 times out of 10, they're going to start spilling stuff. Same thing happens with like dementia and Alzheimer's patients. They start start to lose control of their mind and they just start yapping and saying all kinds of stuff. People have even gone as far as to admitting heinous crimes that they've committed while they were heavily drugged or going through certain mental crises. But as drugged as Michael Jackson was, all this man talked about was being a humanitarian and wanting to help children and wanting to open a hospital. And he talked about his childhood and the struggles that he went through and how because of his childhood, he wanted to prevent other kids from going through the same thing. These are the conversations that Michael Jackson was having while he was under the influence of fucking propofol. Mind you, there was nobody else in the room and Michael didn't know that he was being recorded. So he easily could have snitched on himself, but there was nothing to snitch on. And honestly, bro, the sickest part about the involvement of Conrad Murray is that Michael Jackson trusted him because in 2006, when they first met, they met because he was actually hired to treat Paris for an illness that she had. And during the treatment, he took such good care of her that they became friends. Michael Jackson personally hired him at a salary of $150K a month. But despite Michael's trust and despite their friendship, Conrad Murray still did not properly advise Michael Jackson on what to do with his health, and he approved the continuous use of the propofol without proper notification. Like, he didn't tell anybody he was doing this, so he did this literally under the table because a true medical professional would have told Michael, no, I'm not doing that. You're gonna die, bro. Like, I'm not doing that. And not only will you die, I'm going to jail. And honestly, that just brings me right back to that part in the Michael movie when Joe Jackson was saying to Michael that if you leave this family, you're basically going to be going out there in the world. You're going to be going out there. You're going to have all the money in the world surrounded by a bunch of people who say yes to everything. And as a result, after continued use of this drug amongst others that were found in his system on June 25th, 2009 at 2:26 p.m., Michael Jackson passed away. He was gone. He just died. Cardiac arrest in his sleep at that. The one thing that he fought for the most was just to go to sleep. Ended up being the one thing that killed him. And it's the events that happened after his death that really proved that this had to be something bigger, because as soon as he passed away, his publishing catalog automatically became the topic of discussion. As soon as he died, all of Michael Jackson's assets, including his 50% stake in ATV and Stoney Publishing, became a part of his estate. Now, contrary to what a lot of people believe, because again, I'm trying to keep this thing rooted in facts and not just emotions as a Michael Jackson fan, but contrary to what a lot of people think, Sony actually did not automatically take control of it. Michael's shares were actually given to his estate first, and over the next few years, Michael Jackson's estate became one of the most successful estates in all of celebrity history. It generated billions of dollars, and that money came from stuff like the This Is It documentary film, the Cirque du Soleil shows, hella merchandise. Naturally, of course, his music started to be rebought again, and this is actually when streaming was a thing, so he was getting physical and streaming money. Hella licensing deals, you know, for things like the Michael Jackson Experience game that came out on the Wii in 2010, and they continued to generate income from the publishing deal with ATV and Sony. Sony actually didn't acquire his share of anything until 2016, you know, same year that Prince died. In 2016, the Michael Jackson estate agreed to sell his 50% ownership stake in Sony/ATV to Sony. Sony approximately paid $750 million for Michael's share. And after that transaction, Sony became the sole owner of the Sony/ATV music publishing. Now, at the time, a lot of analysts actually believed that the value of the catalog was even higher than what they paid because of its long-term earning potential. Because again, that stuff never stopped making money, and it still hasn't stopped making money. Then after that, Sony and ATV merged with another publishing company called EMI. The three-way combined company then changed its name to just Sony Music Publishing, and it became the largest music publisher in the world. Now, the thing about that makes it so suspicious, and once again, like I said, too obvious to ignore, is the fact that throughout the years, Michael stated that he never wanted to sell his catalog. He wanted to keep ownership of not just the catalogs he bought, but his own catalog. The comeback that he was preparing for with the This Is It tour would have significantly improved his finances, but then after his death, the estate ended up selling everything back to Sony, which basically means that what they were trying to get him to do since '85 when he bought the catalog eventually happened. It was worth too much money, and not only did they want it back, they wanted everything that he did as well. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that all of this was planned before 2016, but again, bro, some of this shit is just way too obvious to ignore. Now, whether or not you see that sale as just a necessary financial decision, or if you see it as a premeditated attack at his life, that's ultimately left up to you. It's whatever you believe. That's the thing about conspiracies. There's never really any evidence for real to prove anything, but there are a lot of things that you just can't ignore. And I truly believe that through all the humanitarian work that Michael Jackson did, the joy that he brought to people's lives, the impact that his music had on previous generations and generations that still aren't here yet, and the fact that he was extremely business savvy, just put a target on his back that was way too big for even him to escape. And right when he almost escaped it, the powers that be, the higher ups, or whoever the fuck did it, finally got what they wanted. They ended the most powerful man in the industry. So if you ask me, no, Michael Jackson didn't die. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't wasn't just medical malpractice. And yeah, his death was ruled a homicide, with Conrad Murray being the face of his death, but that's all that man really was. He was just the final chess piece on the board to knock out the king. So yeah, if you ask me, June 25th, 2009 was the day that Michael Jackson was murdered. And that concludes my deep dive into the controversy around Michael Jackson's death. This was very emotionally taxing, and yeah, I don't really have much else to say. But if you did enjoy this video and you appreciate what I've done for you guys today, just go ahead and hit me up in the comments and let me know. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more. I got more coming. Rest in peace to Mike. Do him a favor and blast some of his music today. That'll be easy.